Hello, my name's Rachel Geddes. I'm the autism practitioner for the Child Health and Disability team, covering Inverness, Nairn, Badenoch and Strathspey. And I'm also the training coordinator for neurodevelopmental differences over the whole of Highland. Today we're going to be talking about Next Steps. Next Steps is a course that was developed a few years ago, thinking about literally what was the next step for parents who've got a newly diagnosed child on the autistic spectrum. We're going to start reviewing this every couple of years so that the information is up to date. So currently we're 2021 going into 2022. So this information is current at this time. I'm just going to let my colleague introduce herself to you and then we'll get into the session as a whole.
Hello, my name's Shona McPherson. I'm a speech and language therapist based here at the Pines in Inverness, and I'm also involved in delivering training on neurodevelopmental issues. Speak to you later.
So our main focus for this session is going to be about positive parenting. When your child's diagnosed with any condition, it's difficult to really know, what am I supposed to do now? If you are what's described as being neurotypical, in that you don't have a neurodevelopmental difficulty, the way you parent is the way you were parented a lot of the time. And then when your child's given a diagnosis, it's thinking, well, what am I supposed to do differently? How am I supposed to meet the needs of my child? So this is a guy that I really respect. He's called Chris Bonello, and he is autistic and runs his own public speaking business. So he says, I'm autistic, and I ended up being reasonably successful. That was because I had parents who believed in my abilities, teachers who were rooting for me, and a family all focused on what I was and not what I wasn't. Of course, they could have spent my childhood years just mourning over the bad stuff and being surprised when I didn't reach my potential for some reason. So within our team and within the training team, we focus on what a child can do and work with what they can do to help and facilitate them to move forwards. And that's really, really important, because what's historically happened is that people have focused on what was wrong with a child. And actually, that's not in anybody's best interest. We focus on what's right, what their capacity is, what they can do, and how we can help them to move forward. So that's going to be the message behind all of this training. So your child's just been diagnosed with autism. What does that mean? It means that your child has got difficulties in 4 areas, and they were assessed under a system that looks at their social communication, their social interaction, their flexibility of thought, and their sensory processing. So that's how we will now look at how you can help your child with the things that are struggles for them.
So, what is social communication? Well, it's the ability to pass on a message to somebody else to let them know how you're feeling, or what you're wanting, or what you're hoping for. So you might want to tell somebody that you're hungry, or you fancy a drink, or you're upset because you fell earlier, or you're excited because you've met a new friend. In order to do this, you need to find the right words, put them in the correct order, and then deliver this message to the other person in the right way in order for them to interpret your message correctly. Social communication also involves the ability for you to understand what the person is saying back to you. So not only do you need to understand the words they are saying, but also how they're saying it. So that involves the speech tone, their pitch, how high they're saying it. They might be saying it really high if they're excited, or really loudly if they're outside somewhere. Intonation comes into it too, because the way it's said can change the meaning of the same words. For example, if I said very funny, I'm saying that I didn't find something very funny. I'm being sarcastic. But if I said very funny, I couldn't stop laughing, I'm agreeing and saying that I did find it funny. So intonation is really important to understand. And speed can change the ways people speak as well. You also need to understand facial expression and gesture. The use of hands can add meaning to a message, and so can body language. And also proximity. That's how close somebody stands to you. So if somebody comes up to you and whispers in your ear, they're conveying the message, this is a secret. Whereas if somebody shouts to you from across a room, do you want a drink? Well, there's no secret there, is there? So what are the possible struggles with social communication? Well, with verbal communication, if a child or young person doesn't understand the words being used, then they're not going to get the meaning. If they have difficulty processing what is being said and don't have the time to break down all the information, then the meaning is lost. And also, if they only manage to pick up part of an instruction, then all the rest of what you've said to them is lost too. So what can we do to help? Well, keeping your language short and simple is always going to benefit a child. If you were trying to pass on a message, for example, by saying, okay, we've got to go to the shop to get milk. So I want you to put off the telly, grab your shoes, get your coat on, and then we'll head. If you say it in that way, and they only pick up the first part of the message, then they've heard we've got to go to the shop. They might already be at the door, and no way will they have put the telly off, got their jacket, or got their shoes on. So saying things in the right order is really, really important, and also keeping it nice and short and simple. So instead of all that, saying TV off, coat on, shoes on, let's go to the shop. And you can say it in that nice short way, say less and stress, repeat it. TV off, good, coat on, right, shoes on, let's go to the shop. Also, you can back up your message by adding an object of reference. For example, a glove could be used to show that you're going for a walk. So every time you want to go for a walk, you show the same glove, and that helps the child to understand. Or if you're wanting to say, do you want a drink? Hold up a cup, or whatever container or cup that the child uses, or even if it's a bottle. If you hold up the object, it helps back up what you're saying. Because when you use language, as soon as it's said, it's gone. And there's nothing for the child to hold on to. But if you hold up an object, then that helps them to understand better. If you're going out in the car, you could hold up the car keys and consistently do that every time you do go out in the car. That's going to help. Using symbols or photos can also help. We often use what we call a first then board. And it's a really nice, simple way of saying, first we're having breakfast, then you can play with the toys. First breakfast, then toys. And once you've had your breakfast, you can pull that off, put toys up here, and then you can add what's going to happen next, whether you're going out to the shops, whether you're going to visit. And if you're going to visit, you could add a photograph, because photos are really good ways of helping a child to understand where they're going, whether it's to granny's or to friends or to Asda or Tesco's, wherever, school, nursery, all helps. Visual strips are another means of helping a child know the order and the sequence of events. So, for example, here, this is a bedtime sequence. So after the TV's finished, they're going to have their bath, get their jammies on, then have snack, brush teeth. This is a long one. Depending on the ability of the child, it might be much, much shorter. Clearly winter time, so hot water bottle, story, bed, sleep. Nice and simple, and also depending on how much a child can cope with, you keep it shorter than that perhaps. Non-literal language difficulties can also be a real barrier. So if a child takes language literally, they are going to really struggle with all the turns of phrases that we use, like metaphors. He was a man of a mountain. Idioms. Butterflies in your tummy. Similes. Euphemisms. We use euphemisms a lot to help with tricky aspects of our life. If somebody dies, you would say, oh, they've passed over, they've gone to a better place. Or if someone has lost their job, oh, they're between jobs at the moment. It's a nicer way of describing things. But if a child doesn't understand, that can be really difficult. Same with proverbs. Time and tide wait for no man. What does that mean? But if your child has the ability, then explain these to them, and then that will help them understand when they hear that again. The pot calling the kettle black, what on earth? A whole other kettle of fish. We use it so many times, but explaining it if they can understand will help, and if they don't understand, then try and leave them out of your language. So other possible struggles can come if the child is unable to understand non-verbal communication. If your child can't read facial expression, or has limited eye contact, can't read body language or gesture, doesn't understand what you're doing with your hands, and can't read personal space, or stands too close or too far away to a person, then that's going to interfere with their social communication. So we can help by not overusing our own, or being aware of what we are doing with our bodies and our gestures and our facial expressions, and trying to explain them and break them down. If a child is having difficulty with non-verbal communication and you stand over them with your arms folded, tapping, stamping your foot, frowning, but not saying anything, they're not going to pick up any of your messages inferring that you're annoyed or you're fed up or you're wanting them to change what their behaviour. They're not going to pick any of that up. So you have to be aware and understand and explain things. If the child is older, you can help them to learn what facial expressions mean. You can help them through photographs or looking in a mirror so that they can understand what it looks like when you're angry, or when you're sad, or when you're happy, or when you're frustrated. So you can work on that, and you can also teach a child about personal space and social space as they get older, and help them understand that it's okay to be really close with your buddy, but you wouldn't be in that same cozy up position with a teacher. Things change, or with a stranger. So sitting down and explaining these things can really help. The other possible struggles can come at the pre-verbal or early communication stage. So some children with autism have a language delay, and some children will not go on to develop speech. Some children have speech, but they only use it in an echolalic way, so they will only repeat back what you're saying, or will use phrases that they've learned, but they're not in the right context, or they don't have meaning behind them. So some of these children may need another means of communication to help support them. And I've listed here some of the different ways in which different means of communication that we have. The first one here, PECS, here on the slide, stands for Picture Exchange Communication System. And this is a program to assist children to develop a communication system that allows them to meet their various needs by requesting. It's a request system. They will pass over a picture in order to request what they want. POD stands for Pragmatic Organisation Dynamic Display, and it's a book or a device with pages of symbols and words to help a child communicate, and they can go back and forth over the pages pointing to the different words to build up a means to communicate. ALD stands for Aided Language Display, and again this is a symbol display but on a single page containing relevant vocabulary for a specific activity. So perhaps in nursery it could be used in the water tray, and there'll be specific pictures with words all about playing with water, or another one for bubbles, or another one for the animals. And it allows the children to learn new words, or also to start to put words together, or to learn new language functions. Makaton is a unique language program that uses symbols, signs and speech to enable people to communicate. With Makaton, signs are used with speech in spoken word order, and this helps to provide extra clues about what someone is saying. So you say ball and you sign ball, you say eat and you sign the sign for eat. AAC stands for Augmentative and Alternative Communication, and all the above are forms of low-tech AAC. High-tech communication generally refers to electronic devices, which can either be controlled by direct access or by eye scanning or switching. So if you're familiar with any of these, I'm sure then a speech and language therapist will have put these in place for your child. If you don't have a speech and language therapist and you think something like this might help your child, then you can contact the Just Ask line and ask to speak to a speech and language therapist, or speak to another professional that you know, and they can get you in contact with the right person. So, what is social interaction? Well, a social interaction is a conversation between two or more people in society in order to build up relationships so that we learn to live with each other and get on with each other. And we learn to interact in different ways according to the age of the person we're talking to, their education, their ethnic diversity, their religion, and their social experience. You know, a 7-year-old child in Nepal will have a very different social experience to a 7-year-old in Glasgow, and again, a 7-year-old in America. We learn from experience how to interact and how to change our interactions so that they suit. We learn to develop friendships and relationships, and we work out who we get along with and who we don't. So we learn how to avoid certain people. We learn who winds us up and who makes us laugh. We learn through interaction how to resolve conflict so that we hopefully can live peacefully with our next door neighbours and our work colleagues. We learn to work together to reach potential in our learning through school, university, workplaces. And we learn the rules of society. And again, these rules differ depending on where we are. And hopefully we learn to work together to reach shared goals. So what can be the possible struggles with social interaction? Well, for some children and young people, understanding the rules of play can be really challenging. Knowing how to take turns, knowing when to share, waiting can be really challenging for some children and young people, and also learning to lose at games can be really difficult. So what can we do to help? Well, explaining all these things at your own child's level. Use visuals if needed. We've mentioned that already. Think about social stories. Would a social story help? We've got a social stories film on the Pines website and social story workshops which explain how to write social stories and when to use them. Try and support and encourage imaginative play. This can be difficult for some children, but playing games at home, turn-taking games, so board games or ball games, or even taking turns blowing bubbles or blowing up balloons, can all help teach a child to take their turn and to wait. My turn, your turn. And learning to share as well, sharing a bag of crisps, sharing a bowl of pieces of fruit. Waiting can be really hard. So if you can try and teach a child to wait for 2 seconds and then extend it 5 seconds, and then a wee bit longer, that's always going to be a challenge. And sadly, we all have to learn to lose, because we can't always be winners. Nobody is ever going to win all the time. A social story can help with that too. And also just learning that it's okay to lose. The other possible struggles can be understanding the rules of a conversation. A conversation is such a difficult thing when you start to break it down, because who starts the conversation? Who stops it? How many people can be part of the conversation? Whose turn is it to talk? What happens if somebody starts talking over you when you're talking? If you're staying on topic and then somebody else changes the topic, is that okay? Or if you want to introduce a new topic, when do you do that? How do you do that? And how do you show somebody that you're listening and that you're interested, or that you stopped listening and you want to finish the conversation? How do you do that? Role play is a really good thing. So reenacting, if a child explains or teenager comes home and says something broke down, they had a difficult conversation, you can reenact it and role play it and help them find a way of resolving it in a better way. Again, social stories can help with that. And replays. So you reenact the event and then say, how could you have finished this differently? How could this have had a better outcome? Comic strip conversations are similar to social stories. Carol Gray has written a book on comic strip conversations, and she uses cartoons, stick figures and bubbles and thought bubbles to help work out, like a comic, the events, to help them understand how to take a turn, how to stay on topic, to say goodbye or finish a conversation. And just explaining the rules with a crib sheet, writing things down if your child is able to read and write, and having an order on a format can sometimes help too. Another possible area where children can struggle is around understanding the boundaries of school. A lot of neurotypical children intuitively know and learn how to be appropriate with their language, when it's okay to use bad language and when it definitely is not okay to use bad language. Whereas children with neurodevelopmental difficulties, kids with autism, find that extremely difficult and can land themselves in trouble and not even understand why they're in trouble. Often they'll be shouting out, interrupting, talking over the teacher in the class or talking over their friends and just annoying them when they're not meaning to annoy them at all. And they can struggle with maintaining friendships. I heard one incident where two boys, one with autism, were arguing, and the boy with autism got really annoyed and said, "I could punch you in the face." And the other boy said, "I'd like to see you try." Well, of course he did, and landed in trouble. And also just picking up on sarcasm and teasing, even understanding colloquialism, understanding the meanings of words when there's more than one meaning. Would you like a shot at something? Well, what does that mean? Does that mean would you like to take a turn? Or is it a shot of a gun? Or is it an alcoholic shot? It can be really confusing when there's different meanings to different words. And even just picking up, there was another boy when the teacher said to everybody, "Okay, everybody look up." And he looked up at the ceiling instead of looking at the teacher. And then everybody laughed. So how can we help? Well, again, social stories, comic strip conversations, explaining the meanings of words, writing them down if they're able to read, just taking time, having time to troubleshoot and explain things when things have gone wrong, having regular check-ins, at the end of the day, how did the day go? Where did things go wrong? What happened? How can we explain? Having a buddy sometimes in school can be really helpful, somebody that can explain, a gentler person just to show them where they've gone wrong. So just any way that we can support them to understand better where they've gone wrong. And the other area is social situations and changes in behaviour. Why is it different? Why is language different in the playground compared to the classroom? Well, again, a social story can help with that, or a crib sheet. Why is it different talking to the head teacher as opposed to talking to a mate. Again, neurotypical kids intuitively know that you have to be more respectful with adults, especially the head teacher. You can just muck about with your mate. And also even little subtleties with meeting a new person. You are generally more polite with a new person. You wouldn't go straight in there and tease them or talk to them forevermore about your favourite topic of conversation until you've worked out whether they're interested in that topic of conversation. So again, taking time to explain, try and support, having a notebook, having a diary, having quotes or introductions or things on the phone even can help. Having a little checklist. Anything, depending on the age of your child, things can help.
So the third part of the diagnosis is called flexibility of thought. So lots of people talk about how children with autism don't deal with change, very difficult. It's actually a bit more complicated to that. So we're going to look at it in a little bit more detail. We're going to look at it in terms of theory of mind, central coherence, context blindness, and executive functioning. And I'll go on now to explain what all of the different things are. So the first bit of flexibility of thought is theory of mind. And theory of mind means that some of our children have difficulty in understanding that other people have their own points of view. They have difficulty understanding that people have got a different attitude to something, have a different emotion about something. So it can look like the child is completely on their own agenda and isn't taking on board that other people have a different thought, a different feeling, or a different opinion about something that's happening. So how can we help them? So we can read them lots of stories at an appropriate level for that child. That really helps to develop imagination. We can teach them different emotions using card games or social stories. We can help them to take turns by looking at things such as, I often play games with kids thinking about what is my favourite, and I give them different topics about what is my favourite flavour of ice cream, what is my favourite flavour of pizza, or what is my favourite thing to do on a weekend. Okay, so it's getting them to see that other people have a different opinion. This can be quite tricky for some kids because it just hasn't developed just yet. That's not to mean to say that it won't develop, it's just going to take a little bit longer. As a general rule of thumb, these sorts of skills have a big area of development, 0 to 3, and then 3 to 5, and then 5 to 8. So if you think about a child who's just started nursery, the child that comes out of nursery at 5, 2 years later, is very different to the 3-year-old that went in, because they've been able to learn these theory of mind issues in that other people think differently to how I think. That's really tricky if you have something like autism, and it might be in later years where you develop these skills a little bit better. And sometimes a lot of these skills are taught in a way that isn't taught, if you know what I mean. It's almost like they're an intrinsic part of our behaviour. So we don't actually say a lot of the time to neurotypical kids that we've got a different point of view or a different emotion about something. They pick that up out of people's behaviour. And that's really tricky when you have autism. The second bit of this is central coherence. And central coherence means that I can go into a situation and I can read between the lines. I can get the gist of what's going on by looking at people's behaviour, looking at their body language, looking at their facial expression, picking up on their tone. That, again, is really quite difficult if you have autism. And you might find that your children get fixated on detail, so they miss that bigger picture. And they might struggle to keep themselves safe because they're engrossed in one thing. So for instance, if we think about that in relation to road safety, if they've got fixated on a particular car that's on the opposite side of the road, it will be incredibly difficult for them to look in the wider picture of what's coming towards them and how they keep themselves safe. That is central coherence. So how can we help them? We can provide them with additional time to process information, because even if your child has a very high cognitive level, because you don't necessarily have a learning disability if you're autistic, you can be extremely intelligent, they're still going to struggle with the bigger picture. So needing more time is something that we look at in great detail, particularly in things like exams, because being able to read those questions and get the gist of what is being asked is harder when you have a neurodevelopmental processing difficulty. So for instance, I'll give you an example. The young man that I worked with some years ago was doing a history exam, and he was brilliant at history, one of his favourite subjects, but one of the questions said, how would you feel if you were in the trenches in the First World War? Now that is incredibly difficult if you have autism and central coherence problems, because it's really difficult to put yourself in somebody else's shoes. Now that's something that majority of us are quite good at, and we could start to imagine what that might be like. But for him, that was mind-blowing. So having extra time on that question was really quite important for him. We can take time to look at the intricacies of situations. So for instance, if you think about a children's party, there is so much going on in a children's party that being able to take on all of that different information at the same time is really quite overwhelming for some of our children. So if you imagine the noise, the sounds, the visual stress of the balloons or the streamers or the bunting or whatever it might be, you know, there's a bouncy castle and everybody's jumping on it, and I can hear the generator and the kids are screaming, and now they're expecting me to eat. It's incredibly difficult. So being able to do a lot of pre-planning for circumstances like that can really help children with central coherence difficulties, and setting them up to succeed in situations. So a little boy I worked with was going on holiday, and the thing he was most excited about was going in the swimming pool on holiday. But he didn't have the ability to keep himself safe, and he would have wanted to get in the pool without an adult. But we set him up to succeed by having information readily available. So they actually went away with notices that they could put on the inside of the hotel door to say, stop, mummy needs to come with you. And it helped him. We did social stories about how he would need to have an adult with him in order to be able to do that activity, and that really helped him to succeed in that situation. So the next part is context blindness. And context blindness talks about being able to read the context, helps us to modify how we then behave in a situation. So I'm currently sat here with my colleague Shona, and Shona and I have known each other for a long time, and we see each other socially as well as professionally. So the context will change depending on where we are. So within a training situation, our behaviour is going to be different to if we were in the context of being out for lunch, say. Our behaviour will be different in different situations because we're in different contexts, in different parts of our lives. Quite tricky for children with autism. Another thing that can be quite tricky is being able to understand how people are behaving and what the context of their behaviour is. So a classic one is the use of sarcasm or tone of voice. So you can give very mixed messages, as Shona's already spoken about within the communication session, that the way that we communicate can be incredibly confusing. So for instance, if I said, well, that's clever, isn't it? Yeah, I'm giving a message that actually that's a negative. But actually, if you can't read that tone and intonation, you can't get the context behind what I'm saying through my facial expression, my body language, and my tone, then all you're going to hear is, that's clever, isn't it? Okay. whereas that's clever is a positive, whereas the first way I said it was a negative. So being unable to read context can get children into lots of tricky situations. It can also be quite tricky when you're thinking about jokes and banter, in that, I've spoken to children who thought that they were being bullied when actually it was just the other children bantering, teasing, and having the crack, as you would say, in Scotland. Okay, so how can we help? We can keep language really clear and really concrete. We really need to avoid slang, avoid sarcasm, and avoid idioms. You might need to recognise that the child doesn't understand the meaning of jokes, so therefore they could be completely lost on them. We need to work with them so that they learn to understand the different information that they're going to need in different situations. So, for instance, if you think about, let's take the school assembly hall for instance. So school assembly halls tend to be used for lots and lots of different things. And it depends on the context of why you're there, what your behaviour should do. So we've already said that the hall is used for assembly. So that's a very quiet, very sensible, sat down, not speaking activity, looking at the head teacher. That hall is also used for PE. So that's a very quick, very loud, very moving orientated activity, completely different context. It's also then used in most schools for lunch. Okay, so you've got another context in it. And it's how I need to behave in the same place, but with 3 different contexts. That's quite hard when you haven't got a good ability to read context. So for some children, we need to really help them with that and help them to understand that what's appropriate in all of the different situations. And we can do that by using visual timetables, by explaining things to them, using things like social stories. When things go wrong, when children get upset, it might be that we don't know what the reason is. So we need to talk to them. We need to talk to them quietly, calmly, trying to figure it out and trying to help them to sort it out so that the next time they're in that context, they can do it differently, because we don't want them to get constantly distressed and have the same issues and problems over and over again. And we do really need to practice social skills in the real world wherever possible. Doing scenario work, doing role play at home is great if your child's up for that sort of thing, but actually practicing it out in situations and really reinforcing when they get things right is really important. With everything, with any child, reinforcing those positives, saying, wow, you did brilliantly in that situation, but then saying to the child why they did brilliantly. What was it about that situation? So say, for instance, you went to the cinema, saying to a child, I asked you to be quiet and you managed to stay really quiet. You sat still in your seat. You were able to watch the film. That was really successful. So that they know that something's gone right, so they know that they can repeat that the next time they went. Or it might be to say, you did really well with this and really well with that. That bit was a bit of a struggle, wasn't it? What could we do differently next time? How can I help you to manage that situation? And then the final part of flexibility of thought is called executive functioning. And executive functioning focuses on your working memory, your inhibitory control, and your cognitive flexibility, which all sounds a bit wordy, isn't it? But basically it means that I can hold in my head what I need to do next. I know what the process is going to be. I can control my emotions around something. So even if something's upset me, I can control that emotion. And I can initiate a task. I can maintain that task. I can be flexible. So say, for instance, somebody comes into my office and I'm in the middle of typing something and they say, I need to ask you something really, really quickly. I can stop. I can focus on the other person. I can come back to what I'm doing. That's because I've got good executive functioning. Because I have a condition called dyspraxia, that can be a bit of a struggle for me on some days, but on most days I've got some good strategies now. I'm an adult, I've worked through it, I know how I can manage myself. So I'm better at doing that than I would have been as a child. Okay, so some of these things I'm going to suggest are things that I use day in, day out to help to keep myself focused. So planning your day using visual timetables are really, really important. I don't need a visual timetable. Obviously, I can read and write, but I absolutely need a list of what I need to get through that day, because without it, I would not be able to function and complete everything that I needed. So I'm constantly writing things down. Every time somebody says to me, "Can you do that later? Can you do that tomorrow?" it gets written in my diary. A lot of the parents that I work with laugh with me when I write things on my hand, because if it's written on my hand, it means it's got to be done today. Because if I write it in my diary, it might not get done till tomorrow, depending on how my executive functioning is working today. I often have to break things down into small tasks, and that's incredibly important for your child. So when you're getting ready for school, get your bag, get your shoes, get your homework jotter, get your coat on. It's too much, it's overwhelming. You might need to break it down into, right, you've got your shoes on, well done, that's really smashing. Let's get your coat from the cupboard. We sometimes playing things like board games or card games can really help us to improve our problem solving abilities. What I found is that by playing lots of electronic games, it really keeps my brain active and aware, and that's really helps with my concentration and with my focus. I've also found that taking omega-3 fish oils helps significantly with that for me, and it's something that our dietitian does recommend for all children with neurodevelopmental difficulties, because it really does help with the concentration. Playing a sport can really help your brain to adapt quickly to different circumstances, if that's something that you think your child might enjoy. Playing an instrument has the same sort of impact. Lists, and more lists. I love a list. I love visual checklists. Being able to check things on and know that you've achieved it is really reinforcing. And also playing video games in moderation can really help your child with these executive functioning skills, because it's that quick reaction, being able to respond quickly, being able to change your focus is really quite beneficial for everyone with neurodevelopmental difficulties and problems with their executive functioning. The fourth part of the autistic diagnosis is sensory processing. So you'll be aware of the main 5 senses that we use all day, every day. So they are sight, hearing, touch, smell, and taste. We've also got some others that you need to be aware of, particularly for autistic children, because they tend to have more difficulties with them than the rest of us do. So the first one of those is balance. It might be that your child can't ride a bike or walk along a balance beam, or if you're trying to walk in a straight line, they're going on a slant. And the final one is body awareness, and this might be something that you've not heard of before. So proprioception and interoception are 2 areas of body awareness that are linked. So proprioception is thinking about the awareness of the outside of your body, your ability to feel your body and what it's doing. So for instance, I can feel my bum on the chair, I can feel my feet on the floor. Okay. Interoception is about your ability to recognize what's going on inside your body and recognize those messages correctly. So, am I hungry? Am I thirsty? Am I tired? Do I need a wee? Those are the sorts of problems that come into what we call interoception. And we'll go into those in a little bit more detail in a minute. So the way we experience the world would be impacted by what our senses are telling us, such as, I like that smell or I dislike that sound. Now, one of the people that enjoy reading her books is a lady called Winnie Dunn. And she talks about sensory processing a lot. And one of her best analogies is about a pear, as in the fruit, a pear. So some of us may look at a pear and think, "Ooh, lovely, it's a pear, it's really juicy, it tastes nice." Other people might look at a pear and think, "Ooh, scratchy skin, ooh, it's horrible, can't bear it on my teeth, nasty." So it's exactly the same thing, but our sensory awareness in relation to that thing is completely different. So what happens is that we can be hypersensitive, which means we're oversensitive to something, we're feeling something too strongly, or we can be hypo, which means undersensitive. I'm not getting enough feedback. I'm not feeling that very well. And that's often what happens, particularly with regard to interoception, in that it's a real struggle for some of our children to know that they're hungry, they're thirsty, they need a wee, etc. So we'll come back into those in a bit more detail. So the first thing we're going to look at is sound sensitivity. And again, it can be hypo or hyper, depending on the child. Now, there's some confusion about this because on any given day, you might be hyper, later in the day, you might be hypo, or tomorrow, you might be hypo when today you've been hyper. But I would tend to say that most children follow a pattern with their sensory processing difficulties. So you might have a child who's really distressed by a loud noise, such as a school bell or a smoke alarm. You might have a child who's not able to filter out background noise, so everything's really, really irritating to them. You might have a child who's got no awareness of the tone and pitch of their own voice, so they're constantly shouting. Your child might perceive a loud voice as always meaning anger, even when you might have to shout above something to get their attention. If you're shouting, it means you're angry, so perception can be quite difficult. And you might have a child whose hearing is so sensitive that they're hearing noises that we can't hear. The best example I ever heard was from a young man who told me that he could hear the washing drying on the radiator and that he could hear the water contracting through the fabric, and he could also hear like the sort of water dripping out of the fabric. And he'd never mentioned this to mum because he thought that we all could hear it. So mum wasn't aware that this was a problem for him. So during the winter had been putting washing on radiators in his bedroom, and actually found it utterly overwhelming. But when we actually said to her, "This is a problem," she was completely unaware. But then we could ensure that he had a space where he could escape, that overstimulation of his sound sensitivity. So we need to allow access to quiet spaces. We might need to give some prior warning for things like school bells, particularly if there's going to be an alarm check or whatever. We might know that that child's going to need some extra support. Some children use things like noise cancelling headphones because they can't cope with the noise. And conversely, other children might need some noise in order to feel safe. So for instance, I was working with a little girl recently who got to sleep by mum using a hairdryer because she liked the noise of the hairdryer. But poor mum was sat there by the bed with the hairdryer, and I came along and said, buy a fan and put it on the cool setting so it gives her the same noise, but poor mum doesn't have to sit there with the hairdryer, and that's worked really, really well. The second part of this is touch sensitivity. So again, you could be hypo. Some days the slightest touch might feel utterly overwhelming, whereas the next day you're almost not feeling that touch. I've known people break limbs and not be aware of it. Obviously, that's to the extreme. But some kids don't like being touched at all, or they don't like being touched really lightly, and it needs to be quite a firm squeezing touch. Lots and lots of kids with autism love to be squeezed, but that's not to mean that everybody does. So you need to keep an eye out for any injuries that your child might sustain, because they might not be really aware of it. You need to be aware of the level of touch that your child can tolerate and what they like and what they don't like, and giving them the touch that you know they do like. You need to keep food and drink at an acceptable temperature, because they might not be aware of it being too hot, and I have known people burn their mouths. And the same when it comes to hot water or things in your kitchen, because they're not always aware of the heat in things. So being very vigilant with things like that, particularly while your child is very young, is incredibly important. Okay, so now we're moving on to taste sensitivities. Your child might be a picky eater or a selective eater. They might gag while they're eating. They might overfill their mouth. Things might be spilling out of the mouth because they've not got enough sensation within the mouth to be able to tell when it's overfull. We work with lots of children who do something called pica, which is eating extremely inappropriate things, be that a piece of chalk, a rock, a piece of wood, pot puree. I've known people eat. I was talking to somebody recently who, with all the hand sanitizer around, this child's developed quite an obsession with hand sanitizer and likes to eat that, which obviously can create some difficulties. And they might be a nail biter. They might be chewing at the hands and fingers. So potential strategies, how can we help them? So allow them to eat their preferred food. Don't get into a battle about food at this point in time, because you need your child to be eating, okay? You need your child to be eating a reasonable amount of food, and then we can start to introduce other foods. So allow them to eat their preferred food. We sometimes call it the beige diet, because it tends to be made up of chicken nuggets, fish fingers, chips, cereal, toast, yogurt, those sorts of things that are quite bland, quite simple, not overly stimulating. Lots of children will go for those sorts of foods. Any new foods you're going to need to introduce really slowly. We have a colleague called Dave Rex who has some excellent films on the Pines website about how to introduce your child to new foods. So if that's an issue for your child, please give those a watch. They'll probably prefer food to be in separate piles. You can even get really specialist plates now that have got lots of little different containers on them that can help to separate things out. They're unlikely to like things that are different textures within the same food. So lumpy soup, mince and tatties, things that have got hard and soft elements together. So things in gravy, things in sauce, can be quite tricky. If your child's very undersensitive to the processing of taste, you might need to let them chew and suck on strong flavours. They might like really spicy foods. You might need to give them chewy objects. Lots and lots of children go through phases where they're chewing their clothes. Even neurotypical children go through that phase as well. Children with neurodevelopmental difficulties often go through it for a longer period of time, but there are loads of really good things that we can get nowadays to help them to have something to chew rather than it be their school jumper that they're eating on a regular basis. Another thing that can really help is to use a water bottle that's got a really strong sucker or a straw, because again, that's very regulated. So sucking something like a smoothie through a straw is very, very calming because it's taking quite a bit of energy. The next bit is smell sensitivity. So again, you could have a really strong sense of smell. For you ladies out there, I don't know what you were like when you were pregnant, but I could literally smell everything. And that's quite common apparently in pregnancy, but your child might have a very, very strong sense of smell, and they can literally smell all sorts. Conversely, it may be the opposite, and they haven't got the strong sense of smell. So it might be that some of the things they struggle with is that they will actually avoid things that smell really, really strongly. Dinner halls in school tend to be a bit of a problem. They might struggle with using toilets at school or out in public places because of the different smells within them. They might have very little recognition of smell, even if it's a really awful smell. So even things like that could be potentially dangerous to them, like chemicals, household chemicals that you've got at home, or things out in the community, they often don't have that recognition of smell. So we need to ensure that things are kept really safely. They might like to smell other people. They may recognize people by smell. And they might want to sniff themselves. This is actually quite common, particularly when you get to puberty. This can be a bit of a problem because they might like their own body odor, and it's teaching them about, how we can keep that socially acceptable. So it's okay to give your armpit a sniff if that gives you a pleasant sensation, but not in the middle of biology, because that might make you stand out to your peers. So potential strategies, we could have a hanky or a tissue with a pleasant smell to sniff as and when you need it. So in stressful situations, I use smell quite a bit actually. If I'm having what I perceive to be a special outing or something like that, or if I know I'm going into a day which I think is going to be quite stressful, I might use a particular shower gel or a body lotion that's my favourite smell because that helps me to feel safe. You might use non-scented soap or wash powder if they get very overwhelmed by things. We might need to tell some adults around them not to wear strong perfume. We really need to make sure that smoke detectors are working because they might not recognise the smell of smoke. For some children, it's important that we smell the same all of the time because they recognise us by that smell, and it can be quite disturbing for them if we suddenly smell different or we suddenly smell too strongly. We might need to have smelly things around them in order because they like the smell of certain things. So for instance, if it's that they like the smell of citrus fruit, having some oil around them might really help them to feel more comfortable. And if we're in particularly smelly situations, such as say for instance a chemistry lab at school, it might be that child then needs a fresh air break before they're going into something else because it's been quite overwhelming. Okay, so visual sensitivity is the next one. So if you are visually sensitive, it might be that bright lights are very overwhelming for you. You might avoid eye contact. So lots of kids on the autistic spectrum don't like looking directly at you. You might find it really difficult to cope with huge chunks of visual information. So if you can imagine, a primary classroom tends to be very, very overstimulating environments. So it might be that your child's really not coping with a mainstream classroom. They may stare at objects or at people because they're fascinated by the way that something looks. They might like looking at bright light or even the sun, so obviously you need to keep an eye on them so that they're not hurting their eyes. They might flick or spin things in front of their eyes because again it's quite stimulating. They might like reflections, but they might struggle to find the edges of things with boundaries and things like that. I've known kids that have literally needed to hold on to walls, hold on to tables as they've manoeuvred themselves around very centrally overstimulating environments such as classrooms, because too much information can overwhelm you. So potential strategies to help them, you could offer them some sunglasses or a baseball cap for bright places. You could use a cutout frame to isolate the bit that they need to read now. I don't know whether you've come across these, but it's sort of that gives you a small box. Say, for instance, you're looking at a picture book, that you only look at the little bit that's within the frame. It could be quite useful for some children, particularly children who are maybe struggling with the likes of dyslexia as well. That could be quite useful. Sitting them near windows or having them opposite a window where the sun is really bright can be quite distracting for some children. So making sure that we've got a blind or we're sitting them away from that thing. We might use visual timetables for some of our children, might really benefit from having that visual structure to the day to help them to know what's coming next. And that also really helps with your flexibility of thought and your planning for what's coming next. So visual timetables, I'm a huge fan of. We might use what's called an overlay for reading. So lots of children who are dyslexic and lots of children who are autistic have a problem with the processing of written information because it looks like it's jumping all over the place. And it's a condition called Myers-Irlen syndrome. So what we can do for those children is to use a coloured overlay so that it's not the bright white paper that they're looking at, that they're looking, it's almost like a piece of perspex, but it depends on the colour. You know, orange might work for one child, purple might work for another. So sometimes you need to look into that in a little bit more depth. You might use highlighter pens to show what's important. That's something I do frequently. If I'm looking at a big report and I need to pick out the important bits of it, I will go through it with a highlighter pen. You could have labels on your child's drawers. For instance, if you're trying to encourage independence and you want them to put away their own washing, having a label on a drawer that says pants or socks or vests or whatever it happens to be could be really quite useful. Same thing with toy boxes. Having what needs to be in that box in a picture on it is quite good. And so for some of the secondary schools or children going up to secondary schools, having a colour-coded map of the school so they know where they're supposed to be going can be quite helpful. I know with some of the newer built schools within this area, certain subjects have been given a certain colour, which is brilliant, because you know that if you're in red, it's maths, I think. So that you know, so the jotter is red, the folder is red, the corridor is red, the writing on the corridor is red, and it helps you to start to identify where you are in appropriate places, which is really quite useful for some children. So the ones that you might not be as aware of as you were as the first 5 that we've just looked at, so proprioception and interoception, getting those messages from your body. Where do I start? Where do I stop? Do you have a child who sits next to you on the sofa but can't tell where you start and they stop, if you know what I mean? So they're literally on your knee rather than next to you. Being able to know how close they should be to somebody. Are they in your face? Is the proximity too close? Knowing, say for instance, if I put my hands into my handbag, I would be able to find my mobile phone without looking for it because I know what it feels like. If your proprioception's bad, that's more difficult. It's knowing where your body is in its space, so it's not touching or invading other people's space. And knowing, recognizing those internal messages that tell you I'm hungry, I'm thirsty, I need a wee, can be huge struggles. So what we find is that lots of kids are really late to potty train because they're not recognizing those messages. Or you have a kid who's constantly like this, they're shuffling and jiggling and wobbling about and jumping. It's because they're constantly looking for feedback from their body. So it's like an internal caffeine rush, if you would. So imagine having 5 or 6 cups of coffee and your heart's pounding and you're sort of running at a rate of knots. That's what poor proprioception can feel like. So that child is constantly on the go, needing to move, needing to do something. So what we need to consider as potential strategies for those children is considering giving them movement breaks. So when they lose concentration, when they're starting to fidget more, giving them a movement break, getting them out into the playgrounds or into the garden if you're at home, thinking about what it is they need to do. So for instance, with my child who's dyslexic, dyspraxic, and some attention difficulties, if we need to do homework, I make him do something really, really physical first because that helps him to feel more settled. So you could have something that we describe as being a deep pressure diet. Okay, so if you think that your child's got some difficulties in this area, my advice would be to look at a different resource that we have on the Pines website called Frazzled Fred's Guide to Sensory Processing, because that will give you loads and loads of ideas of how you can help your child to manage this a bit better. So we sometimes use lap pads, squeeze vests, or weighted blankets to give people some firm pressure through their body. They can all be really useful. But if you think that's an issue for your child, go and have a look at that other resource as well. And then the final one within sensory processing is the vestibular or the balance. So your child might suffer from motion sickness. They might have a fear of stairs or escalators or lifts because of the movement. They might not be able to ride a bike. They might find walking in a straight line incredibly difficult. They might be unable to jump, hop, or skip. Or they may have the desire to constantly be rocking, spinning, or moving. Now, that's described as stimming. We all stim all of the time. So you've probably noticed in the bits of this film as we go through, I have a habit of moving my fringe out of my face. Now that is because it's getting in my face, but it's also a bit of a stim for me. It's quite calming. Lots of people might twiddle with their hair, or they might tap a pencil on the table, they might jiggle their ankles. We all do it to some extent, and it can be quite calming and quite regulating. We should never stop a child from stimming because it's a way of regulating your body. The only time we would step in is if what they are doing is dangerous. So for instance, if you've got a child who's rocking to such an extent that they're whacking the head on the wall behind them, then clearly we're going to step in. If you've got a child who's just rocking because they find it very calming, then it's fine to leave them. So potential strategies that might help, you might need to use travel sickness tablets for long journeys or journeys with windy roads if your child has a vestibular problem. You might need to help and support your child when moving up and down stairs. You might need to use a three-wheeled bike as opposed to a two-wheeled bike because the balance is difficult. You can get hold of something called wobble cushions that you can put on your chair. So say, for instance, your child really struggles with these balance and vestibular issues when eating a meal and they're constantly on the move. If you sit them on a wobble cushion where they've then got to hold themselves on that wobble, that can really help them to focus, allowing them to stim if they need to. And for some children, having access to things like swings and roundabouts is really important. I work with one young man who absolutely loves this piece of playground equipment that they have in one of the schools in Inverness that literally spins you round at a rate of knots. But actually, when he's been on that piece of playground equipment, his ability to concentrate is massively better than what it was prior to it. So sometimes allowing access to those sorts of things is really important.
If you have received a diagnosis of autism or another diagnosis of ADHD or DCD for a family member, then you may be experiencing a whole range of emotions. If your journey has been a long journey, and because of lockdown for a lot of your families, it has been much longer than it should have been, then you may well be feeling a range of emotions. It may be disbelief, it may be shock, sadness, anger. It could also be a sense of relief that finally you've come to a conclusion. All of these emotions are okay and are part of your journey too. And being able to talk to them with other people is really helpful. If you can talk to other family members or other professionals, then or other families that have received a diagnosis as well, it can all be of benefit. Diagnosis can be reinforcing for you as well. However, a diagnosis should never be the reason not to put something in place for your child. Whatever needs your child has, they should be met. regardless of a diagnosis. So all strategies should be put in place, whether it's in nursery or in school, whether there is a diagnosis or not. But now that you have a diagnosis, you can ensure that everything is put in place for your child. This is the beginning, not the end. So what next, and who will be involved? Well, you should already have a named person, a lead professional, and depending on the age of your child, this will be the health visitor if they're in nursery, or the key person at your child's school, such as the head or deputy head. They should formulate a child's plan and or an IEP, which is an individual educational plan, to ensure your child's needs are being met. And if you have recently just received a diagnosis, then you should ask for your child's plan to be opened again so that you can update it and get all the details put in place so that it is up to date for you and for your child. You may also receive support from the Children and Families Social Work team in the form of a children's service worker. They can support you at home and also with perhaps after school funding. And if your child's case is more complex and there are medical needs, then it may be that a more specific person becomes the named person, a medical professional perhaps. So what other professionals may you come into contact with on your journey? Well, the occupational therapist may become involved if you need any adaptations made to your home to support your child, whether that's in the bathroom, the shower, stairs, safety measures, looking at your garden area. They can also help support with your children's functional skills, whether that's with eating, drinking, any motor skills or sensory issues that they may have. If your child's having any difficulties accessing their education in school, then the educational psychologist may become involved, and they would work with school to help give advice and support in that area. If your child has any diet, then a dietitian may become involved. And in fact, Dave Rex is an expert on autism and has produced a film called Food, Mood and Behaviour, which you can access from the Pines website. If you Google thepineshighland.com, you'll be able to find that there amongst other things that he's posted. And if your child is experiencing severe anxiety, severe behaviour problems, depression, then a referral to a clinical psychology could be made. The psychological services home visiting teachers can become involved at the start, helping prepare your child for transition into nursery. So they would get involved at home with you to support with learning skills there. Children's service workers, CSWs, may also support with transitioning between school and community and home as well, if that was needed. And a speech and language therapist may become involved if your child needed support or advice on any speech, language or communication issues. And in fact, all this information can be found on the Pines website. If you look under our partners and our services, there's more information about all of this here. And also if you wanted to phone the Just Ask helpline, which is open on Tuesdays and Thursdays between 1 and 4 p.m. You could ask for support and advice in any specific areas and you would be put through to the relevant professional who could support you there. And the Just Ask helpline phone number is 0300 303 1365. And again, that is also on our Pines website. What additional services do we have in Highland? Well, Thriving Families have got excellent information. They are an information service for all additional needs, and they run excellent monthly sessions for parents of children who have ASD. At the moment, that's online, again, through you find it through the Pines website, and they post on their website, Thriving Families website, information about that. The National Autistic Society gives brilliant advice. They have Alison Footed, who has a phenomenal amount of knowledge and experience and can advise on all services available. And there's also a library there. Carers Advocacy can help you to speak up on behalf of your child in difficult circumstances. So if you're needing support in that kind of area, you can contact them. Child Advocacy via Bernardo's help your child to speak up for themselves when they're going through difficult circumstances. So that's for older children. And SNAP is an after-school club for kids with additional needs. I know SNAP has a waiting list at the moment, but again, you can find more information about them on the Pines website if you wanted to make contact. Connecting Carers is a support group for parents with a child with additional need, and there's also a sibling support group there. And there are various parent discussion groups that you can find on Facebook, which is a nice way of getting in contact with other parents to share experiences. And again, the neurodevelopmental training courses across Highland are now online and are available again on the Pines website.
Okay, so financial support. This can be a bit of a tricky one. You are entitled to some financial support from the government. They have recognised that actually having a child with additional needs can put the family under additional pressure. And if that is the case in your family, then by all means you should apply for these benefits. So say, for instance, some of the children that I work with are unable to be in school full time, so that means that one of the parents is unable to work. This is obviously going to have a financial impact on your family, so therefore you should be applying for things like disability living allowance. So depending on the complexity of needs of your child, disability living allowance is currently at the rate of £23.70 to £152.15 per week, dependent on the level of needs. If your child gets mid or high rate in the care components of disability living allowance, you can also apply for what's called carers allowance, and that is £67.60 a week, and you are eligible for that even if you're working, as long as you earn less than £128 a week. DLA forms are hard, is what I would say. I spend my entire life focusing on positives of the children that I work with and how we can help them to move forward, to improve, to have more capacity and to manage better. When we're thinking about DLA forms, you have to focus on all of the difficulties, and you have to fill that form in as on your average bad day rather than your average good day, which is, it can be quite demoralizing. So it's good to have somebody to help you to fill those forms in, because it's hard work, and if you have struggles with form filling, then Inverness Citizens Advice Bureau will be more than happy to help you with those forms. And families tell me that the Raigmore branch of the Citizen Advice are particularly good at DLA forms. So please do apply for that if your child's needs are having a financial impact on your family. So within the Highland Council, we have certain strategies that are put in place to help to support your child with their needs. So the first of those documents is GERFEC, and that's an acronym for Getting It Right for Every Child. That's a government-led policy that the Highland Council works towards. So part of GERFEC is that your child should have what's called a child's plan, and that the child should be assessed under what is called the My World Triangle. And that looks at what the child needs, what their parents need in order to care for them, and the wider world around them, the community, the school, and things like that. So each of your children should have a child's plan and an action plan that states what your child's needs are. So this is a diagram of the My Will triangle, and this looks at the how I grow and develop, what I need from the people that look after me, and my wider world, which means the school community, you know, if they're going to the brownies or things like that, that's the wider world. So under this, we will look at what strengths your child has, and then we will also look at what pressures your child has. And then from the pressures, you could start to think about, well, what does this child need in order to make their world a little bit easier? So you might have something that's called a single agency plan. So it might just be held by the school, and the school are helping you with all of the difficulties around your child. Or you might have what's called a multi-agency plan, and that's because different people are involved with your child. So it might be that you have a social worker, or you have a CSW, or there are other people that are needed to help to meet the needs of your child, and that's a multiple agency plan. Say, for instance, your child's got communication difficulties and they see a speech and language therapist, then that speech and language therapist will be asked for their thoughts and opinions on the plan and will be included in meetings. So it differs from child to child depending on what the level of need is, but all children with a diagnosis of autism should have a child's plan. That child's plan will be, if your child is under 5, will be held by your health visitor. If they are over 5, will be held by the school. If your case is complex, it might be held by somebody else, but the school will be very, very involved in that process. There are also another couple of documents that we use, some frequently, some infrequently. So lots of children with autism have what we called an individual education plan, or an IEP. And that sets targets and monitors progress for your child in school. That tends to be if their learning needs are very different to the other children within their class. If they're keeping up with the other children within their class, then they probably won't have an IEP. We also have something called a CSP, which is a coordinated support plan. It's very infrequent that we have a CSP because that's for children who are having very significant struggles with their education and where multiple agencies are involved in the planning and processing of their education. So it's infrequent that children have a CSP.
Autism is not a disease. It's simply a different way of thinking. It's a different way that the brain operates, and we have to learn how to understand that better. There's no cure needed for someone's method of existence. We need to learn how they work. So we now have 10 positive tips to help you with this. Okay, tip number 1, think about the way you speak. Like I said before, try and keep everything clear and simple. Don't overload your child with too much language. And try and be aware of how many questions you ask and what kind of questions you ask as well. You know, an open-ended question like, what would you like to eat? Can be really hard to reply to. But if you make it simpler by saying banana or crisps, and even hold up the two objects so that they can see them, that's a much, much easier question to answer. And making comments is even better than questions. So if a child's not sure how to play, you could perhaps say Lego first, then football. Nice and clear, rather than what are we going to play now? Remember to use your child's name at the start, because if you have more than one family member in the house, it can be really hard for your child to know that you're talking to them. So always direct their name first, John or Fred. Let's play. And give your child time to process. Remember that they've got to take in the words you're saying, and sometimes children take a long time to process what's being said. Give them that time before you then come in with another instruction or another turn of phrase. And remember also to keep your instructions nice and short and simple. Be aware of how you ask for things. This cartoon helps us realise that a lot of people with autism are going to struggle with sort of indirect kind of innuendo type statements. Saying something like, the trash needs to be taken out, or I need a drink, is not going to get a response. But being more direct and saying, please take the trash out in a minute, or please make me a cup of tea in a minute, is going to get a far more straightforward response, because it's much clearer and simpler for the person with autism to understand. Tip number 2, try and be as visual as possible. I said it earlier in the slides and I'm saying it again, because visuals can support your child in so many different ways to help them if they have any kind of language difficulties. Visuals can be in the form of pictures, photographs, or objects, and it just helps the child understand what you're talking about. Especially if your child is wanting to make a choice. Like I said before, holding up 2 things or saying milk or juice, you know, it just makes life easier for them. Also, visuals are permanent. They don't disappear like words do as soon as you've spoken them. They also allow time for your child to process what's being said, because they stay there. They help kids see what you mean. They're concrete, they're visible, and it doesn't need a lot of interpretation to work out what the breakfast symbol means. It means breakfast. It also helps a child build independence, because if you're putting up a visual structure to the day, they can work through what needs to be done, or a visual timeline for washing their hands, drying their hands, you know, putting the soap on. It helps with independence. They're also transferable between environments and people. So it's great if you're using visuals at home for the school or the nursery to be using them too, and the childminder or granny, whoever is also seeing the child on a regular basis, if they can be using the same visuals, then that's really helpful. And they have no attitude, you know, they don't get huffy visuals, they don't go and walk off if you take your time. They're there until the job is done. And kids don't have to work out any non-verbal means of communication, no tone, no nuances. You know, if you were to say to a child, I think you better go and spend a penny, what on earth is she on about? But if you hold up the toilet symbol, it's clear and simple. Oh, I need to use the toilet.
Okay, tip number 3, take your time. Plan what needs to happen in different situations from your child's perspective. So every child is going to need something slightly different. And what we need to try and do is see it from the child's point of view and prepare them for that situation. So thinking about any situation, will it cause stress? How could it be avoided? Do they even need to do it? Try to be proactive and not reactive. Okay, so let's take shoe shopping as an example. For the majority of children that I've worked with over the years, shoe shopping seems to be one of those highly stressful situations. So taking it from the child's point of view, am I going to take them shoe shopping straight after school? No, I'm not. I'm going to choose a day that's quiet, that's contained, that they're likely to be less stressed in. If for those of you that are not aware, Clark's shoe shop will actually open early for you or stay late for you if you ring them and tell them that you've got a child with additional needs. Am I going to do that? Is that in their best interests? Could I avoid it altogether? Can I go online and buy 10 pairs of shoes that might meet their needs? You can certainly buy a shoe measuring device online nowadays. You can measure your child's feet, order the 10 pairs of shoes, get them to try them on, in a safe and controlled situation at home and send back the 9 pairs that don't meet their needs. It's about being proactive. Can they cope with it? Is it something that I can avoid? How can I make this easier? How can I make this better? Never beat yourself up when you have to react to something, because nobody can pre-plan everything. So you might think that you've planned it to the nth degree and still something goes wrong. It's okay. Do you know what? We're not going to get it right 100% of the time. Where you can, plan some more, and avoid the situations that you don't need to go in. There's so much we can do digitally nowadays that it has certainly made life so much easier for people on the autistic spectrum. Number 4, consider the environment. Can your child cope with that environment? So thinking back to what we talked about earlier in the session about sensory processing. Where are you going to? What is the sensory information? Is it noisy? Is it bright lights? Is there lots of crowd? Is there lots of smells? All of these things can be massively overwhelming for people on the autistic spectrum. But your child might not be able to tell you what the problem is. So from the perspective of a friend of mine who's now in his late 40s, he's on the autistic spectrum. And when his mum used to take him shopping, she thought that he had a problem with the crowds, but actually in retrospect it wasn't the crowds, it was the noise. But it wasn't the noise from the people, it was the noise from jewelry shops. And my friend's American, so if he was going into the mall to do shopping with mum could tell that he was really overwhelmed. But what was happening was his hearing system was so sensory, hyper sensitive, that he could actually hear the vibration of jewelry shops. So it was, he found incredibly overstimulating, but couldn't tell his mum at that time because he didn't realise that his mum couldn't hear those things, or he couldn't explain it. So we need to watch out for what are the really subtle triggers for our children. What are the things that they cope with and what they don't cope with? So thinking back a few years for my own child, he really struggled with restaurants and going out to eat. He found those very overstimulating. We reduced and that we'd looked at the menu prior to going into that restaurant. That helped with some of the environmental overstimulus for him. So thinking about things like supermarkets, does your child really need to go into Tesco's? I don't like going in myself. At certain points a day, is it going to be massively overstimulating? Certainly don't go in there on a Saturday afternoon because it's hideous. Can you do online shopping? Can you scan as you shop? I've not been brave enough to try scan as you shop yet because I'm not very technical. But every time I'm in the supermarket and I see somebody beeping their shopping, I think you really must try that, because actually it would take out some of the anxiety of that getting through the the unpacking all of your shopping onto the line and then the repacking it. I could cut out some of that anxiety, couldn't I? So I'm really going to have to be brave and try to learn scan as you shop. Or could you consider teaching your child skills by using something called backwards chaining? So backward chaining relates to meeting with success at the end of something that you're learning. So say, for instance, you want your child to be able to go into a shop. You want them to be able to learn how to go and buy a pint of milk or whatever. It's thinking about going to the smallest shop you could possibly find first, and then taking it backwards to big shops. What you can also do through backwards chaining is teach children skills. So for instance, if you think about putting on a coat, it's actually quite a complicated set of movements that you need to do to put a coat on. And if you're trying to teach them how to do it and they're meeting with failure every time, it's very demoralizing. Backward chaining can really help because you put the coat on for them and you teach them the last bit, which might be zipping up the zip. So when they've zipped up the zip, they've met with success. When they've met with that success repeatedly, you then take it down into hooking the bottom of the zip into it. They've met with success. The next time you might teach them about putting one arm in, but you're doing the other bit. So every time with backward chaining, you're meeting with success, and it's very motivating. Number 5 is about planning and prioritising. You're not going to be able to do everything that you want to do in one day. You have to seriously think about what is manageable for your child on any given day, because they are not going to be able to manage the amount of things that a neurotypical child will be able to manage. So I've mentioned my son. I've also got a daughter, and they are in fact twins, and she is neurotypical. So I know that what me and her might manage on a day, say for instance, uniform shopping for school, will be a fair bit. I know that doing that same task with my son is going to take more broken down into smaller chunks, because he's not going to manage it. So for her, we might go to the shop, we might try the things on and buy what she likes. She's at that sort of age now where she wants a lot of control over what she's wearing. For my son, I pretty much order everything online, and he tries it at home, and then it doesn't result in him becoming overstimulated and overwhelmed. So we think about the pitfalls and what your child's already had to cope with that day or that week. Thinking back to that shoe shop, you're not seriously going to do that on a Friday afternoon because they're exhausted. How can we help that child to avoid having a meltdown because they're just so sensorily overwhelmed? Children can learn to adapt to situations, but it is going to take time. And it is going to take a huge amount of their emotional resources. There's only so much you can do on any given day. Say, for instance, your child needs to go to a birthday party of their best friend from school. They're really motivated to go to that birthday party, but they already also need their hair cutting. You're not going to attempt that on the same weekend. You need to plan and prioritise what is manageable, what can this child cope with, and how are we going to do that slightly differently. Okay. Number 6, change is really difficult. This goes back to what we were talking about earlier on flexibility of thought and executive functioning. Change is really, really hard when you don't have those skills. You can't read between the lines. You don't get the gist of the situation. Things can feel very, very overwhelming very, very quickly. So you need to think about how you can help your child by giving advance warning. Yeah, so for some children, advance warning really works. For others, it doesn't, because they then start to overthink it. So you know your child better than anyone. Plan ahead, be aware of what level of support they're likely to need in each situation. Does it need to happen now, or could it be postponed until later or another day? How are they going to be able to cope with that change? So, for instance, recently, one of my young men on my caseload has started swimming with the school, which is slightly different to the social swimming that he does with his mum and his brother. So it's thinking about, could I provide that child with a social story about what the difference will be, how they will need to manage the changing rooms, those sorts of things, and keeping that consistent, because that change is massively overwhelming for that child. So we need to keep it really consistent. Everybody needs to be doing exactly the same thing around that child. Think before you state what consequences or rewards will be, as some of our children are incredibly literal and will expect it to happen. I got a great example of literal thinking yesterday when I was talking to a mum. They were doing some baking and she'd turned her back for a moment, and as she turned her back, she told him to put the eggs into the mixture, and when she turned round, he had indeed put the eggs into the mixture, shells and all. He'd literally just picked up 2 eggs and popped them in the flour, because what she hadn't said is crack the eggs in order to put them into the mixture. So very, very literal thinkers, some kids with autism. And if you say something's going to happen, it needs to happen. So what's really important is focusing on positive reinforcement, because punishment does not work. Telling a child off for something that's gone wrong is just demoralizing. So we need to really focus on the what's going right and reinforcing what's going right, rather than focusing on what's going wrong. If you say something, it's going to happen, follow it through. Because if you don't, then the lack of trust or believing that you're going to say what you're going to do what you've said you're going to do, again, is quite difficult. And always have a change card in your pocket if your child is very focused on change. When thinking about this, if you feel that your child has got executive functioning difficulties, they might be mild, they might be severe. If this is a real issue for your child, we also have another film on the Pines website called Helping Your Child to Cope with Change, and that looks at all of the flexibility thought issues and gives you lots and lots of examples of how you can help. So that one might be worth a watch as well for you.
Tip number 7, you have permission to be different. Nobody expects you to know all the answers, and no parent does. We learn from our mistakes. Some of the best inventions came from a mistake. They're okay. It's okay. If your child has had a bad day and you've had to scrap all the plans for the evening, that's okay. No two children are the same. You know your child best. You know your child's limits. You know your limits. And if enough is enough, that's good enough. There's always another day or another week or another time to try again. Be realistic and be kind to yourself. That is more than enough. Tip number 8, motivate and reward. We all need little rewards in our lives, and we all like to be motivated and praised, don't we? If we need to give ourselves that extra cup of coffee before we leave the house, then we give ourselves. If we need to stop and have that bar of chocolate or that nice little treat from a takeaway, we give it to ourselves. These little things are important to make life agreeable. If we need to have that phone call with a friend and give ourselves an extra 5 minutes of downtime, that's okay. And our children are the same. And you know your child. What does your child like? What will motivate them? What will get them going? What do they need to have a successful day? You know, a lot of our children like to spend time on their own, jumping on the trampoline or lining up their cars or collecting stones or playing with ribbons. You know, whatever it is, if that's what they like and that's what they need, that is okay. And if it's different to others, so what? Repetitive behaviours or self-stimulatory behaviour, shortened to stimming, is often a child's way of calming or self-regulating themselves. And if that's jumping up and down or flapping or spinning or rocking, then that's okay. If they're doing it in a safe way that's not harming themselves or harming others, then let them carry on. Don't try and stop it. You would only stop it if it was harming them or it was intrusive or unacceptable. Otherwise, let them do it. Yes. Tip number 9, keep going. It's really important to share with professionals and friends or family. Don't bottle things up. That'll just lead to pressure building in yourself. Try and keep a sense of humour. It's always good to smile and laugh. It helps us to self-regulate ourselves, and it's always good to share a funny story, isn't it? Look after yourself. Give yourself time. If you need that 5 minutes on your own, locked in the bathroom or in your room or outside, try and give it to yourself. That is really important. And professionals are here to help and to work along with you in the way that suits you and your child best. Our last tip, number 10, you know your child best. And it's good to share your knowledge of your child with the professionals that are involved in order that they can support your child effectively and you as well. Try and have the confidence to express yourself because your voice is really important. And if you haven't, then ask somebody else to speak up for you, whether it's a relative or a friend or advocacy, the professional support that we mentioned earlier. If you don't understand something, ask. there is never a daft question or a wrong question. If you don't understand, then ask for clarity. That is really important. And the services are there to support you. We would never want you going away from a meeting or an appointment feeling confused or misunderstood, or that your questions weren't answered. That is really important for you and for your child.
So just to conclude, you're probably doing a lot of the things that we've talked about already. You know your child really well, and instinctively you've put things in place that you know makes your life easier. You know, it might be really simple things, it might be more complex things, but you've already started to simplify your language or plan your day, prioritize what needs to happen, because you know what they cope with and what they don't. And remember that you are human. No one gets it right 100% of the time. Concentrate on the positives and not the challenges. Think about what your child can do rather than focusing on what your child can't do. Working towards making meaningful change to your child. There will be bad days. There will be days that go wrong. There will be things that come out of your mouth sometimes and you think, oh my goodness, why did I say that? 30 years I've been working with people with autism, and there will still be a day where I think, for goodness sake, woman, why did you just say that, or why did you do that? And that we're human. You're not a Power Ranger. Give yourself a break and just move forward positively with your amazing child. Best of luck. Have a look at some of the other training that we have available, and I'm sure that we'll see you on other training in the future. Thanks.